For 70 years, every serious attempt to try and create a European army has failed for the same reason. France stopped the European defense community in 1954, and later attempts to try and combine forces also fizzled out. Even current French President Emmanuel Macron, who has been suggesting a joint European force since 2017, has been mostly ignored. But this time, that pattern may be finally changing. The European Union now has a Commissioner for Defence, and they have officially proposed a European Defence Union. And this new plan would include its own Security Council, a standing army of 100,000 soldiers, and a military headquarters separate from NATO. Just last week, EU leaders met in Cyprus and agreed to start planning what would actually happen if Article 42.7, the EU's promise of mutual defence, were ever used. And this is the biggest change to European security since the Berlin Wall fell. And so today we're looking at why 7 decades of failure suddenly broke through, and what the new Kubilius blueprint suggests, and what this huge reallocation of money for defense means for military companies, government debt, and the supply of rare earth materials over the next 10 years. My name is Nick, and this is Coin Bureau Finance. Now, to understand why this moment is different, you need to know why all of the previous attempts were set up to fail. The first major plan, the European Defence Community, was a treaty signed in 1952 by France, West Germany, Italy, and the Benelux countries. It would have created one army with a single command, mixed divisions, and a shared buying of weapons. However, in August 1954, the French National Assembly, the very group that suggested the plan, voted it down. The problem was always the same. Who has control over the military? French politicians didn't want Germany to rearm under a non-French flag, and they refused to hand over control of French forces to an authority in Brussels. And that refusal became the hurdle every later attempt also failed to get over. The Maastricht Treaty in 1992 created the Common Foreign and Security Policy, but it required every country to agree, meaning any single capital could veto any important decision. After Europe had to rely heavily on US air power during the Kosovo crisis, France and Britain signed the St. Malo Declaration in 1998, asking for Europe to have its own military capability. And this led to the European Security and Defence Policy. But it was just a plan without a real command structure, no permanent soldiers, and no real budget. And then there are Macron's repeated efforts since 2017. He called for a, quote, true European army in his Sorbonne speech, and his follow-up in 2018, made after Trump started questioning NATO's worth, called for a, quote, real European army as a direct response. And other European capitals were, however, politely skeptical at best. And after Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, Macron pushed harder for Europe to be strategically independent and to have integrated defense. And the result was more promises of spending, but no real change to who actually commands what. In short, every past attempt failed because the political cost of giving up control of their national armies was always seen as worse than the strategic risk of continued dependence on the US. And this brings us to what has changed, because the strategic cost of depending on Washington is no longer a theory. It can be measured right now. And let's start with the clear messages. President Trump has publicly called NATO weak, and when asked about Article 5, the an attack on one is an attack on all clause, he said there are, quote, numerous definitions, which is an astonishing thing to say about the one-paragraph foundation of European security since 1949. In March 2026, US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth refused to clearly promise that the US would uphold Article 5, saying the decision was, quote, left to the president. He told European allies that the Strait of Hormuz is, quote, much more their fight than ours. The Pentagon has also reportedly created a system to rank allies, separating model partners from difficult partners based on their support for US actions in the Middle East. The institutional signals, though, are even stronger than the words. Hegseth and Secretary of State Marco Rubio missed several NATO meetings in 2025 and 2026, and the US has given major NATO command posts in Naples and Norfolk over to European officers. The 2026 National Defense Strategy, released in January, clearly told European allies they must take primary responsibility for standard defense, and that US support would be, quote, critical but more limited. Also, the Pentagon didn't release its Global Posture Review, leaving European military planners in the dark. And then came Operation Epic Fury, the US-Israel campaign against Iran that started on February 28, 2026. And this is where the general worry about American capability turned into a hard number. According to analysis, the campaign used about 1,100 stealth cruise missiles in 7 weeks, nearly a quarter of the entire US supply. Over 1,000 Tomahawks were fired, which is about 10 times what they would buy in a year, and about half the inventory of Patriot interceptors were used up. Replacing these supplies is estimated to take between 1 and 4 years. 3 of the 4 available US carrier strike groups are now tied up in the Middle East, and the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit was moved from the Indo-Pacific to the Gulf. And this creates a gap in the deterrence against China that experts have called critical. Senator Jack Reed said simply that replacing what was used up could take years at current production rates. Simply put, the Iran campaign showed the limitations facing the US military's ability to wage war on multiple fronts. The United States no longer has the missiles, the aircraft carriers, or the political focus to simultaneously deter Russia, show decisive power in the Middle East, and contain China in the Indo-Pacific. And so, European capitals have done the math and concluded they must take responsibility for their own defense. Now, the person who designed the European Defence Union proposal is Andreas Kubilius, the EU's first ever Commissioner for Defence, and a former Prime Minister of Lithuania, a country that sits uncomfortably close to Russia. Now, the proposal has 4 main parts, and first is a new treaty between governments deliberately based on the Schengen Agreement, which would let willing member states move forward without unanimous consent, the requirement that killed every previous integration attempt. And the second is the stand-in force of 100,000 personnel, designed to be a high-readiness corps that can be deployed without waiting for 27 separate parliamentary votes. And third is a European Security Council of 10 to 12 permanent members, importantly including the United Kingdom, Norway, and Ukraine, along with major EU capitals. And fourth is a dedicated EU military headquarters operating outside NATO's existing command structure. Kubilius' message is intentional, and he has stated that Europe must, quote, learn to fight as Europe, not as a collection of 27 countries, and asked rhetorically if the United States would be militarily stronger if it operated as 50 different separate state armies instead of one single federal force. He clearly stated, though, that the defense union would strengthen, not replace NATO, building what he calls a stronger European side within the alliance, designed to take on the responsibilities currently held by American troops in Europe. And the gap in manufacturing ability is what makes this proposal urgent. According to Kubilius' own data, Russia produced 1,100 cruise missiles and 900 ballistic missiles last year. The European Union produced 300 and 0 respectively. Russia manufactures 4 million artillery shells annually, while the EU only manages half of that. A European force without the industrial capacity to back it up is just for show, and Brussels knows this. And then came the Cyprus summit on April 23rd and 24th. EU leaders agreed to develop a plan for Article 42.7 of the Lisbon Treaty, the bloc's mutual defense clause. Article 42.7 has only been used once in history. It was used by France after the November 2015 Paris attacks, and it resulted in a political response, not a military one. And the summit specifically instructed the Commission to define what happens, who does what, and who commands what when the clause is used. And practice exercises are scheduled for May to test 3 hypothetical attack scenarios. The fact that a 27-member bloc is now drafting a clear response plan for its own mutual defense clause tells you everything you need to know about how much they trust NATO's Article 5 to work automatically. And here is where the proposal could still fail, because the hardest unresolved question is the same obstacle that stopped every previous attempt. Whose troops are used, who decides when they are deployed, and how can a 27-member bloc actually make a deployment decision in days instead of months? And the areas of disagreement are already visible. France, Germany, and the Nordic-Baltic bloc are leading the effort. Macron updated French nuclear policy in March to include, quote, forward deterrence, allowing temporary deployment of nuclear-armed aircraft to Germany and Poland with joint exercises, a significant step up in commitment. Friedrich Merz has openly stated that Germany will become the, quote, strongest conventional army in Europe. Defense Minister Boris Pistorius has set 2029 as the risk date for a potential Russian invasion of NATO territory. The opposition is concentrated where you would expect. Hungary under Viktor Orban had traditionally blocked EU defense integration and has close ties to Moscow, though that position may change following his recent electoral defeat. And parts of southern Europe view defense integration mostly as a spending requirement rather than a strategic need. Poland, despite leading in raw spending at about 4.7% of GDP, prefers a strong one-on-one relationship with Washington because of its location. The Schengen model workaround is why Kubilius designed the proposal as an agreement between governments rather than an amendment of an EU treaty, because a core group of countries can proceed without the need for unanimity. But Schengen governs border crossing, while defense integration involves military command over actual divisions, which is a very different question of national sovereignty. Anders Fogh Rasmussen, the former NATO Secretary General, has called the current EU proposals, quote, fluffy, and argued that real defense requires a, quote, coalition of the willing, led by Britain and France, not Brussels institutional frameworks. And that criticism highlights the trust gap that the next 2 years must close. And this is where the underlying reasons for success get really interesting, because the foundations for this attempt are totally different from anything that came before. And let's start with Germany, because in March 2025, the German parliament passed a constitutional change that exempted defense spending above 1% of GDP from the Schuldenbremse, the debt brake included in their basic law since 2009. And the same reform created a €500 billion infrastructure special fund operating entirely outside of the deficit limit. Friedrich Merz called it, quote, 5 minutes to midnight for Europe. German bond yields spiked within days as markets adjusted to the largest increase in German government borrowing in modern history. Defense spending is expected to reach €162 billion by 2029, approaching 3.5% of GDP. And the Bundeswehr is aiming to expand from 180,000 active personnel to 460,000 by 2035. Across the bloc, by February 2026, 17 of 27 member states had activated the Stability and Growth Pact escape clause for defense spending. The Rearm Europe initiative is mobilizing €800 billion for continental defense by 2030. At the Hague Summit in June 2025, NATO members committed to spending 5% of GDP by 2035, and for the first time since 2014, all 32 members met the original 2% threshold. The money flows are already very visible. Rheinmetall's order book has grown from €25 billion at the end of 2022 to almost €64 billion, and its share price is up about 500% from before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. BAE Systems is up about 18% year to date, with a record £74 billion order backlog. The Future of European Defence ETF has crossed $3 billion in assets under management within 2 years of launch, an incredible achievement for a product focused on a very specific theme. But the weakness lies in what Europe cannot yet build alone. Intelligence, command and control, satellite communications, missile defense, integrated logistics. The entire system of support still relies heavily on American systems. And then there is the rare earth bottleneck. China's 2025 export restrictions on gallium, germanium, and rare earth magnets, materials vital for Eurofighter radars, F-35 parts, and guided munitions, have already caused the Van Eck rare earth ETF to rise about 159% over the past year. A think tank called CEPA has suggested an innovation and enabler quota allocating at least 10% of European defense procurement to cutting-edge technologies, specifically to address these capability gaps. And this is the scoreboard that will tell you over the next 24 months whether the project is real or just talk. So, either the European Defense Union is the most significant change to continental security since the Cold War, or it's just the latest entry in a 7-decade list of failed attempts. The argument for it being real has never been stronger in modern European history. The American security guarantee has clearly weakened. Germany has broken its post-war budget policy, and the industrial commitments locked in across France, Poland, the Nordics, and the UK will be hard to undo. The argument against it is the same obstacle that killed the European defense community back in 1954. 27 sovereign nations finding common ground on whose flag flies over the command post, whose parliament authorizes the deployment, and whose treasury writes the largest checks. 3 concrete measurements will tell us which path Europe is actually on. Does the Article 42.7 plan get drafted and adopted by member states? Does the standing force figure receive firm national troop commitments? And does the separate military headquarters start building physical infrastructure? If those 3 things happen, Europe is rearming as a unified bloc for the first time in modern history, and the implications for defense stocks, government debt issuance, and critical mineral supply chains will define the next decade. So, the question now is whether 27 capitals can finally achieve what every previous generation of European leaders has failed to deliver. Will the Kubilius blueprint, the German budget shift, and the Article 42.7 framework actually result in a deployable continental force by 2030? Or will the same objections and obstacles that killed every previous attempt prove that a European army is structurally impossible, no matter how visibly the American support continues to fade? Feel free to share your strong opinions in the comments down below. And if you want to understand how Germany's broken debt brake is reshaping the European sovereign bond market and what that means for money flows over the next decade, then you can check out our video on that right over here. And that's all from me today. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you again soon. This is Nick, signing off.